Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Our guest today is environmental consultant Dr. Patrick Moore. In 1971, he was one of the co-founders of Greenpeace. Today, he is considered one of the most controversial environmental activists in the world. In co-founding Greenpeace, he was following principles he believed in. Today, he does the same. In the 80s, he looked at Greenpeace and said the environmental movement had lost sight of what was important and lost touch with science. Greenpeace said it was in fact him who had lost his way. Today, we hear what he has to say on a variety of topics, like climate, the environmental movement, and genetically modified organisms. Welcome.
Thanks, Stuart. Nice to be here.
You are somebody that I've been wanting to talk to for a long time because I find right now the discussion that's going on around environment and anything to do with it is so charged that if you don't completely agree with somebody, then you must be drinking the bathwater or you've been paid off. And I can't think of anybody who has like deeper sort of credentials in the environmental activism world than you. And the moment that you start to look at things and say, well, let me look at this versus this, it's as though you did things on a campaign by campaign basis. What's the science behind it? Why are we doing these things? The moment that you question any of those objectives, all of a sudden you are to be discredited. How did we get to this point?
Well, one of the reasons we got to this point was because in the earlier years of the environmental movement, we addressed successfully what you call the low-hanging fruit. I mean, the obvious issues. Nuclear war, killing whales, toxic waste. Those things were addressed. The air is so much cleaner now in our big cities in the West than it was at that time in the 70s. The Chinese have some work to do, but they're doing it now that they're getting some wealth and have discretionary income, as it's called when it's personal. They can address their climate and their pollution issues. So I think that the problem is we kind of got to a point where we won. So we were so successful that you almost had to invent issues in order to remain on the opposite side against the establishment, because the establishment had basically adopted pretty well all of the issues that we championed in those early years.
Because they made sense.
They did make sense. And now we've got a bunch of issues. Let's start with genetic modification. There is nothing in those seeds that is harmful. There's no ghost in there, there's no devil in there, there's no evil in there, and so it ends up being directed towards Monsanto as an evil company, because there's really nothing in the seeds. The seeds are actually preferred by farmers. That's why they buy them, if they're allowed to. In many countries, 66, I think, GM seeds are banned, so the farmers cannot buy them. But if they were legalized, they would, because they're better. And so an improvement in technology is being shunned and made to seem evil and harmful for no reason whatsoever. It's sort of like when trains were invented and people said, we don't want trains, we're going to stay with horses.
Yeah, but what's also interesting that you bring up GMOs, if we take a look at the case of Mark Linus, who was the leading advocate against, he starts to examine the science and says, I was wrong. The people who followed behind him on the anti-GMO campaign weren't willing to listen to his reasoning about why he had changed his stance there. And so it comes back to, well, then why are they so opposed to this that if even the guy who is leading the charge in the anti-GMO globally says, you know, now that I've looked at the science, I got it wrong.
There's money in it, in being opposed. I mean, the March Against Monsanto and the GM Watch and Greenpeace are raising millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars on being opposed to GMOs. And it's way bigger than the anti-vaxxer movement, which is also completely stupid. But the GMO movement got traction with Frankenstein seeds and killer tomatoes and Terminator seeds, it was a total propaganda campaign, because propaganda is really about making what it should be a neutral descriptor like genetic modification, right? There's nothing evil sounding about it if you just look at the two words. Genetic, okay, it's got to do with DNA, and modifying. Like, I'm genetically modified. I'm not identical to my parents, right? So
Well, the moment you get ill, you're genetically modified.
well,
Your genomic structure changes just by being injured or getting ill. So everything's changing all the time.
it is, and every single individual organism that was produced by sexual reproduction is genetically modified. So the term is being used in a very narrow way when actually it's a very broad term. And then they say this never happens in nature.
But that's not true.
It's not true. No, it's called horizontal gene transfer by bacteria, and it's been going on since bacteria, which were the first organisms of any able to reproduce. 3.5 billion years ago, bacteria have been carrying pieces of DNA into other cells all through the history of evolution. As a matter of fact, horizontal gene transfer is an important part of evolution, along with radiation, which brings us to nuclear energy. And there's another subject where people are deathly afraid. You know, in both Chernobyl and Fukushima, in Chernobyl there were deaths. Most of them were fighting the fire and trying to contain the situation, but they got heavily irradiated, a lot of those people.
Yes.
And that reactor class should never have been built in the first place. The Russians took a shortcut during the Cold War. The West had no say in what Russia was doing, and they took their weapons reactors and cookie-cuttered them all across the former Soviet Union into power reactors with a design that could blow up.
Well, it's flawed engineering and probably flawed construction as well.
Well, flawed practice at the time of the explosion. They did something that they should never have done. They turned off the safety systems so that they wouldn't interfere with their experiment. So it wasn't during normal operating procedures that Chernobyl blew up. It was during an experiment, and the experiment went very bad. And Fukushima, nobody died.
Right.
Right? And in both cases, they evacuated all these people. In Fukushima, they evacuated them ahead of the radiation.
Yes.
In Chernobyl, they waited for a week or two, so people were already irradiated. In both cases, it is clear that the damage caused by the evacuation was far more severe than if they'd left the people where they were. They maybe should have made sure they didn't eat food that was grown in that soil for a while, but 1,600 people died due to the evacuation in Fukushima. For example,
Due to the evacuation?
Yes, they evacuated an intensive care unit in a hospital to a gymnasium. Many of those people died because they didn't have intensive care anymore. And in Chernobyl, it was even worse. Like in 340,000 people who were evacuated after Chernobyl, they were put into tenement blocks around the city of Kiev from their rural homes around the reactor. The suicide, murder, drug abuse, alcoholism, wife beating, and child abuse, and everything else that occurred as a result of that in this ghetto that they created for these 340,000 people. There isn't one known case of cancer in those people that can be attributed to radiation. And so terrible social situation occurred and even the World Health Organization, they've taken it down, probably because they've been pressured into doing it. But for some time, they had a statement saying that the effect of the evacuation was far worse than anything that could have been expected from them staying where they were.
I got to get you to hang on for just 1 second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
So to go back a little bit further, what happened around 3 Mile Island then?
Nothing. Oh, there was an evacuation of pregnant women, but that was, in anticipation of there being a problem. The problem never occurred. And yet, to this day, there's mythology around all of these things. Greenpeace says 300,000 people died from Chernobyl. Of course, they don't have names and there's no graves, but they just make it up. And that's a hallmark of the movement today, is that they just make stuff up. They're making up, for example, this ocean acidification story around the climate issue and CO2, that all the shellfish and corals are going to melt because the ocean is going to become acidic, when in fact that could never happen. The ocean is actually basic.
Okay, I have trouble understanding that because I have no way of knowing how do you measure whether or not the ocean is becoming acidic. But I had somebody
Well,
in here.
they can't actually.
Yeah. Well, I had Brian Riddell from the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and he talks about ocean acidification.
Yes.
I've got the U.S. consulate bringing in an expert, Scott Downey, from the East Coast, who wants to come and talk about ocean acidification. And I'm going, okay.
It's a meme. It's fabricated. They say, here's how it all starts with them saying that since 1750, the pH of the world's ocean has gone down by 0.1 of a pH, from 8.2 to 8.1, or is it 8.3 to 8.2, whatever. The pH of the ocean changes on a daily basis by more than half a pH, a 0.5. It changes all around the world. Near shore, where water's coming in from the land, it can be way down into the low 7s, even into the 6.5 or so. So there is no average pH of the oceans. And these guys are saying that it was 8.3 or whatever in 1750, and now it's 8.2 because of CO2. Nobody measured the pH of the oceans in 1750. As a matter of fact, the concept of pH wasn't invented until 1913, and it wasn't until 1924 that an accurate tool was created to measure pH. And you can't measure pH continuously. You can only measure it once, and then you have to measure it again with a sample. There's no tool that you can just put in the water that gives you a track reading like you can with temperature or high humidity.
So you're saying that the comparison between 1750 and now is just
made up in a model. So you find in all these things, when you go down to it, they're saying evidence. They say there's evidence that oxygen will be depleted in the oceans by 2030. That's a big one, just came out. It's on all the media. Oxygen will be depleted. And they say there's evidence. Where is the evidence? It's in a computer model that they put the assumptions into. So they build a computer model that gives them the answer they want and then tell you they've got evidence that this is going to happen in the future. That's what the climate models are the same. The IPCC models, there's 102 of them now.
102 different models?
102 $100 million plus models. Every institution that's studying climate has to have its own supercomputer model of the future climate. And so they feed the information into it. We learned when we were punching cards back in university that garbage in, garbage out, right? We knew that back then. And if there's a very good graph, you can get it on the internet, just Google IPCC climate model versus reality or something like that. And you'll see that the climate models are taking it off the top, and reality is down here, barely changing. There hasn't, until.
Well, I've tried to read a number of those reports, and I don't get very far. It becomes incredibly confusing to me.
It's very thick.
And
but here's the kind of thing you have to parse this stuff. They say it's extremely likely that we are the main cause of the warming since 1950. They call it mid-20th century.
I thought it was 1880 that we were going
mid-20th
back to.
century. We do go back there. We have
because that's when they
measurements.
first measured CO2 in the environment in Hawaii.
1959, Keeling. That's the first accurate measurement of CO2 on a continuous basis was started in 1959. But the IPCC recognizes that the amount of CO2 emissions from human activity before 1950 was not significant compared to what it has been. Now it's an exponential curve.
It's true, it's happening.
But the temperature of the Earth is not going up on an exponential curve. It's basically been flat for 20 years, except for this last El Nino, which spiked like it did in '98.
Yes.
So they all go, whoo, there it is, we're warming.
Yeah, but that's an El Nino effect,
Yes.
which is completely different.
It will come back down to a La Nina.
Yes.
And we don't know where it's going to go from here.
This is our second break, but I'm anxious to get back to this. We'll be back in a moment.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
The problem is people who say they can predict the future seem smarter than everybody else. Because if you say, oh no, I can't predict the future like that guy can, but they can't predict the future. People have been trying, mostly the predictions of the future are about doom. There's
Well,
very
and
few-
those are the only ones that seem to take hold.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm going to die.
But if I predicted there'll be record grain harvests in 2040, who's going to pay attention to that? Nobody's even interested in it.
Well,
Because
you must be getting paid by somebody to make that prediction.
Precisely. Yet there are record grain harvests this year. And even with the drought in India this year, they've maintained their grain harvest because of technology.
And GMOs.
And GMO. Well, not so much. There's
didn't
no
he-
GMO grains in India.
Not anymore?
There's no GMO grains anywhere because bread is sacred and it's the staff of life, and so we mustn't allow genetically modified wheat. And even though they have produced genetically modified wheat that is superior to the wheat we have now in terms of resistance to weeds and insects and all of that, it's not being permitted. And here's a good example. Philippines has one genetically modified crop approved, corn. Bangladesh has one genetically approved crop, eggplant. They call it brinjal. India has one genetically modified crop, cotton. So they're all in South Asia. I mean, surely they could all have all three. Would be sort of logical. If the Philippines can have corn, why can't Bangladesh and India? If India can have cotton, why can't Bangladesh and the Philippines? Where's the logic there? There isn't any. It's pure politics. And I am still an activist in that I've for 3 years now been campaigning for golden rice.
Right.
And there is a situation where the anti-human aspect of the green movement comes right to the top. 2 million kids die every year from vitamin A deficiency. 250,000 of those have gone blind before they die, and Greenpeace is opposed to golden rice, which, if it was a medicine that could cure malaria or AIDS or Ebola or this new virus, then it would be adopted immediately. And 15 years later, golden rice is still not approved and is still opposed by the mainstream environmental movement, even though it could save 2 million kids every year. And they have truck out all these arguments about how it's fake and about how it will cause disruption of the gene pool in the world or whatever. They've got a ton of arguments that to some people might look valid because they put them out there. They say there will be unforeseen human health and environmental consequences from golden rice. When someone says unforeseen, it's kind of like a boogeyman behind a tree somewhere, that's going to come out and scare you.
Right.
But what it really means is we don't know a damn thing about this, what could go wrong. Because if they knew an actual thing that could go wrong, they would say what it was. So the word unforeseen is really a tricky piece of propaganda because it makes people afraid of the unknown, when in fact, that's just it. It's unknown. There's nothing known that could go wrong.
But that has been the course of human development. We try things, we find out what's going to happen, we make adjustments.
Exactly. But
That's been my perspective.
But these people, what their position is we mustn't try it we mustn't do anything. So the so-called precautionary principle, which is actually not a principle. If it was, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. But the precautionary approach is look both ways before you cross the street. Then look again. But you're going to cross the street when you see that the coast is clear. A jet plane comes out or a grand piano falls out of a window upstairs and kills you while you're crossing the street. That was the risk you took, even though you had tried your best to avoid any risk. You cannot eliminate risk.
I love your passion, but unfortunately I've got to take a quick commercial break here. We'll be back in a moment.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
You hear people say, yeah, okay, that's an individual risk. But what we're talking about is existential risk. If we get this wrong, we're done. I was at an event just the other night where somebody was saying, we got a year or two and then we're done. Thinking, really? What a horrible way to feel when you wake up in the morning thinking...
How about what a horrible way to teach your children? That's the thing that really bothers me, is our children are being taught that we are evil and nature is good and we are destroying nature and we're done, right? It's all going to be over. We're digging ourselves into extinction. Or a beautiful young woman in a grade 11 class in New York City says to me, Dr. Moore, when do you think the world is going to come to an end? right? As if it's going to happen in her lifetime. And that's what people are being taught. And with the climate issue especially, which, you know, the climate issue has corrupted science more than anything since the Enlightenment. It's like right back to Galileo and the Inquisition. I mean, most people don't know that Galileo was actually put under house arrest for the remainder of his life.
That's right.
And he was the only one speaking up. He was a skeptic.
Yeah.
And nowadays, we're told that the skeptic should be put in jail. There's not just one skeptic on climate, there's thousands of us, including people like Freeman Dyson and Will Happer, of, you know, the top physicists.
Ivor, how do you pronounce his last name? Giever, noted Nobel laureate, who walked away from the Physicist Society of America saying,
yes,
the science, how can you say the science is complete? Because science is never complete.
The corruption is public funding of science. And it's turned into, I mean, the private sector would never fund this. Because what's the product? Is there a useful product coming out of climate research? What is the main product? It's fear. And so fear begets more public money. So like the IPCC, for example, everybody thinks is the top science institution. It's a political institution to begin with. It's part of the United Nations. It's not a science institution. But they use science in a way to perpetuate themselves. Most people think the IPCC is studying the climate. No, their mandate is only to look at human effects on the climate, not the natural effects that have been changing the climate for millions of years. They just only look at the human effects. So if they said, well, it's not actually being caused by humans, it's being caused by the sun and ultraviolet radiation or
solar
whatever.
activity.
Yeah. If they said that, or even if they said, well, it is being caused by people, but it's not a disaster, it's not a catastrophe, a little bit of warming is going to be good, and besides, the carbon dioxide is making all the trees and food crops grow 15% faster than they did 50 years ago, and that's a really positive thing. So a little bit of warming and fertilizing, finally putting CO2 back up to a level that plants find more productive is a good thing.
As you can see, Dr. Moore is an impassioned guest. So impassioned that we went way beyond our allotted time. And he provided us with enough material for 2 shows. So we're going to end this conversation now and then pick it up in a later episode.